Negative. Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask leave for an extended introduction.
Ministers asked leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In your gallery, I would like to introduce some special guests who are here with us today. Tim McMillan, President and CEO of CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and of course, former Minister of Energy with our government. Brad Harold is with him, VP Western Canada Operations with CAP. Sean Pascoe, Manager of Saskatchewan Operations, also with CAP. And from Canadian Natural Resources, CNRL, Mr. Speaker, Joel Gablehouse, Public Affairs Director, Alan Francu, CNRL Senior VP of Production, Calvin Bast, CNRL VP Production East, and from Husky Energy, Mr. Speaker, Andrew Dahlin, Senior VP Heavy Oil and Oil Sands, and Travis Davies, Manager of Government Relations. Mr. Speaker, together these fine folks represent a pretty mighty cross-reference when it comes to energy powerhouses here in the province of Saskatchewan, whose investment and commitment benefit everyone who lives here, because they help make the economy run. Mr. McMillan, of course, has been a strong advocate for all things energy, including for crucial changes that were needed to Bill C-69, changes we hope continue to be entertained by the federal government. Because energy has very clearly, as we all know, become a national unity issue, and we all need to embrace positive energy. Which is why, Mr. Speaker, it continues to be so very puzzling, including to stakeholders right here in the province, that the economy critics from across the aisle, who I'm sure will be joining in shortly in introductions, remain so utterly unengaged when it comes to any discussions, questions or debates that relate to energy, which is noteworthy by its absence, Mr. Speaker, when you consider the importance of energy and companies such as these to the economy of the province of Saskatchewan. Please join me, Mr. Speaker, in welcoming these guests today to Saskatchewan and to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Normally we say we join in the introduction, but I can't quite join in the exact spirit of partisanship that the minister chose to follow, and erroneous comments as well, as we're very much engaged in discussions with the industry. But I would like to nonetheless welcome all of these folks to the legislature, folks from Husky, folks from CN, and in particular CAP. We were very happy to sit down with Mr. McMillan today, appreciated his insights on the industry and the advocacy that he does on behalf of the industry for Saskatchewan and workers here, and would like to welcome him back to his legislature that he knows so well, and all of those visitors. While I'm on my feet, I'd also like to welcome the folks in the gallery opposite. We have here 50 plus. A pretty big crew of folks from the Teamsters, folks from rail workers. We have folks behind us as well. Well, looks like we're over 100. Wow, that's a lot of people to come down to the legislature and express their opinion. I really appreciate them coming, and I'll single out just a couple of folks and then wrap up, Mr. Speaker. We have John Chalmers. Thanks for the wave, John. Darren Bergen. back on this side, and Dale Beta, all of whom are local chairs with Teamsters Division 847, as well as Nick Anglos, the legislative rep with the Teamsters. I'd like to ask all of the members to join me in welcoming these folks to their legislative building.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with member opposite, and I won't get into the issue about what comments are made, but I want to welcome these members to the legislature today. The issues that they raise are ones that are important for all of us, important for our province, and the need for them to have a voice and to be able to raise their issues, both in the provincial legislature and elsewhere, is something we should all value and respect. And to them, on behalf of the government, I'd like to say welcome to your legislature, and we wish you some productive times in the days ahead.
Recognize the member for Toronto North East.
Seek leave for an extended introduction.
Members ask leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seated in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, are two amazing young women, Carly and Brett Rumpel. They'll wave that there. Carly has just returned from Brazil, Mr. Speaker, where she was at the Youth Egg Summit down in Brazil, working with, she was one of 100 people selected from over 3,000 applicants who went to try to develop how their ideas can be brought to market fruition. Before that, Carly has also traveled extensively. She's been to Toronto twice as part of the National 4-H Conference. She's been to Ottawa, where she was chosen as a future influencer at the Grow Canada Conference by the Canada Seed Trade Association. Her sister Brett is no less traveled. In fact, she's even been a few more places internationally. She went to Iowa as one of 4 Canadians to the Global Youth Institute. She went to Taiwan on a 4-H exchange, and just last month she represented Canada at the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, where she spoke to a number of people at the Canadian Embassy about women in agriculture, 4-H, and youth leadership, and the importance of hearing their voices. Carly and her sister Brett are also are both pursuing post-secondary, or I guess in Carly's case, has completed post-secondary. She has her Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University in Guelph, and Brett is working on her applied plant ecology at the University of Saskatchewan. So I'd ask all members to join with me in welcoming these two young women to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask for leave for an extended introduction.
Ministers ask leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd also like to join with the member opposite in welcoming these two young female leaders in the agricultural sector to their Legislative Assembly. It's really great to see so many prominent young female leaders in agriculture, and I want to thank you for representing our province so well on some of the national and international stages. I'd also like to say, Mr. Speaker, that as the world increasingly moves towards applied learning and work-integrated learning, there are the polytechnics, and they're a very strong partner for us, particularly as we look towards fulfilling our new growth plan objectives. And to that end, I'd like to welcome Mitch Holash, who is the chair of the board of Sask Polytech, a prominent member of the Prince Albert community and a great strategic thinker and leader, not just for Sask Poly, Mr. Speaker, but for the regional colleges sector that Sask Poly brokers programs to. Also like to introduce, of course, he's no stranger to us, Dr. Larry Rosia. He's well known, if you could give a wave, Larry, well known to many of us as the CEO of Saskatchewan Polytechnic, a tireless and I think visionary leader with ambitious aspirations to be the best polytechnic in Canada. Sask Poly has an employment rate for its graduates that is consistently in the 90% and plus range, Mr. Speaker, with an Indigenous graduate employment rate of around 88%, Mr. Speaker. Through his leadership, this institution is constantly working with industry partners to make sure our programming is responsive to industry needs. He's an important thought leader in our post-secondary space. Please join me in welcoming these two great leaders to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to join with the minister, and thanks for the heads up in terms of presence of these post-secondary education leaders here today at the Legislative Assembly. Mitch Holash and Dr. Larry Rosia, of course. Long records of substantial contribution to the post-secondary education sector in the province, and indeed to the province itself. So again, on behalf of the official opposition, we join with the minister in welcoming these two individuals to their Legislative Assembly.
Here.
Recognize the Minister of Crown Investments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the minister in welcoming a good constituent of mine and a good friend of mine, Mitch Holash from Prince Albert. He's sitting up in the far row up against the wall there, but in Prince Albert, Mitch is so well known. There's not a project that he doesn't volunteer. His name doesn't appear there. He's one of the most outstanding fundraisers that we have in our community. He's contributed to the Rawlinson Centre and to the Bring Back the Magic campaign and pretty much all the campaigns in Prince Albert. And Mitch is the go-to guy where they go and ask him for his advice and his help. And he continues to do that. I don't know how he has time to run his law practice and to be involved with the Polytech and all the volunteer work that he does in Prince Albert. He's an amazing individual in Prince Albert. We're so pleased and so fortunate to be able to have him living in our city. And I'd like all members to join me in welcoming Mitch to his Legislative Assembly.
Here.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the minister and the member across also to welcome Mitch Holash to the legislature. I do have to correct the member from Prince Albert Carleton, but he is my constituent and he lives actually down the street from me. So it's wonderful to see you here, Mitch. But what we do agree on, Mr. Speaker, is that Mitch Holash is a very community-minded individual. His work with Polytech is very important, but he's involved in so many groups in Prince Albert and especially the arts community, and we see each other at a lot of the plays and arts events that are happening in the community. So I'd like to welcome Mitch to his legislature and look forward to talking with him later. Thank you.
Here. Recognize a member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to introduce the grade 10 class from Vanier Collegiate. There's 19 students here this afternoon to watch the proceedings, and I'd like to welcome them here. Vanier is one of those schools that does very well as far as doing extra things. In fact, they've got 2 entrepreneurial classes, one of which had arranged a trade show on Saturday, which was very successful by the amount of people who were there. I'd also like to take this time to congratulate the Vanier Spirits recently for winning the provincial girls volleyball. So congratulations to them. Mr. Speaker, they are an aggressive young school, and you can see it right from the teacher that's accompanying them today, Dana Skoropad. Dana is one of those teachers who goes a little bit above and beyond, bringing the class here. And I understand, I haven't had this verified by him, but I understand he took one of his classes to a court one time to watch the proceedings in the court case. So you can see that he goes above and beyond. So I appreciate him bringing the class here, and I'm looking forward to the photo and the meeting with them a little later. I ask all members to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just join with a very brief but important introduction to join in the welcome of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that are here today, the leadership, Tim McMillan, certainly Sean and Brad, who really represent producers and this industry so well in Saskatchewan and across Canada, as well as the leadership of CNRL. It's a real honor and privilege to have you here today as well. This is a critical industry to our country. It's so important to Saskatchewan. We need to remain or work to be united towards needed pipeline capacity, Mr. Speaker, and addressing things like the capital conditions that are really challenging our industry. I'll just leave it there, Mr. Speaker, but this is an industry I'm proud to stand with, that the official opposition is proud to stand with, and we'll work to make sure there's a bright future in this province and country.
Recognize the member for Arm River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to join with my good colleague from Moose Jaw North and welcome Dana here. Dana is a constituent of mine from the town of Chamberlain. He's also a good friend of mine. And he also will be sitting on this side of the House after next election. He will be replacing me, and I know that he will do as good a job as me, and probably better than I will. And I think he will enjoy it more than I do in the last year. But I want to welcome him and his class. As a member from Moose Jaw had said, Dana is always faithful in bringing a class here every year and always interested in politics. And I know that he will be an excellent candidate for next election and do an excellent job representing Arm River. Thank you.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Jana Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise once again today to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens from people all across our province, from communities and businesses all across the province as it relates to the Sask Party's imposition of the PST onto construction labour. Of course, they hiked the PST and expanded it right across a whole host of goods, accounting for $1 billion tax hike in the province. That's hit households hard. Households that are now paying more than $800 per year more in PST than they were just 4 years ago. Mr. Speaker, it's hurting households, hurting our economy. As it relates to the tax on the construction industry, this is the epitome of a job-killing tax, Mr. Speaker. Very sadly, we see permits down all across Saskatchewan. We see projects that have been shelved. We see thousands of hardworking tradespeople, Mr. Speaker, who have lost employment in this very important industry. So many of them forced to find employment in provinces outside of Saskatchewan, leaving the province that they know and love. A loss for them and their family, a tremendous loss for us as a province, Mr. Speaker. The prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions are signed by concerned residents of Regina. I so submit.
As a member for Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose an unfair and ineffective carbon tax in the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Moose Jaw, Mortlach, and Kildare. I do so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to this Assembly calling for a $15 minimum wage. And the undersigned residents of this province want to bring to our attention the following, that Saskatchewan has the lowest minimum wage in Canada, and that minimum wage should not be a poverty wage, and that Saskatchewan people working full-time at minimum wage jobs are now living in poverty. And that a $15 minimum wage will improve health and well-being and lift Saskatchewan workers out of poverty. You know, Mr. Speaker, a $15 minimum wage will support local businesses and make the economy run by putting more money into workers' pockets to spend in our communities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to adopt a plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour for all workers. And Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from Regina, Moose Jaw, Langham, Yorkton, Gravelbourg, Assiniboia, and I think that's Battlefords and Needham-Wall. I do so present. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Hear. Recognize the member for John Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party government to fix the crisis in our classroom. Those who have signed the petition wish to draw our attention to the following: that the Sask Party government's cuts mean falling per-student funding and fewer supports for students who need a little extra help, that the cuts leave educators without the resources that they need to support student learning, and that this Sask Party government is ignoring overcrowding in our classrooms by refusing to track and report classroom sizes. Also, that the lack of funding for school infrastructure has led to crumbling and overcrowded schools right across Saskatchewan, and that the Sask Party government's failure to invest in our classrooms is having serious consequences today and will continue into the future unless something is done. I'll read the prayer, Mr. Speaker. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to immediately fix the crisis in our classrooms by properly funding the most important investment that we can make in our children. Those who have signed this petition today, Mr. Speaker, reside in Prince Albert. I do so present.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise to present a petition to end unacceptable emergency room wait times, an issue that we've raised again and again in this Assembly. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that despite the Sask Party government's promise to eliminate emergency room wait times in 2012, wait times in Saskatchewan's emergency rooms continue to grow. That instead of making smart investments to meet emergency room targets, that the Sask Party government watered down targets to the point where they no longer exist. And that Sask Party has cut funding to address emergency room wait times and has no meaningful strategy to get emergency room wait times under control. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to fully fund and execute a plan, as they promised to do in 2012, to lower and eventually end ER wait times across Saskatchewan. This petition is signed by individuals from Prince Albert, Weyburn, and Estevan. I do so present.
As a member for Prince Albert, Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, I stand in my place today to present a petition for the provincial government to develop and implement a suicide prevention strategy. The individuals who signed this petition want to bring the following points to your attention. The Saskatchewan Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act was introduced in 2018 but has not been passed because it has not received support from the Sask Party government. That suicide remains the second leading cause of death for young people from ages 15 to 34 in Canada. And suicide rates for First Nations people in Saskatchewan are 4 times higher than non-First Nations people. And that in 2018, 1 in 3 suicides were among children in care. That nearly 2,100 people died from suicide in Saskatchewan from 2005 to 2018. And that the 49% increase in annual suicides in Saskatchewan since 2005 amounts to a crisis. And Mr. Speaker, when we have communities declaring a state of crisis and 10-year-olds losing hope and losing their life because they lost hope, we cannot wait any longer to pass this legislation. If this legislation can save 1 life, it was well worth it. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the provincial government to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to address suicide in Saskatchewan. We have petitions signed from people from all over Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. This particular petition was signed by individuals from Saskatoon. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, a new cafe in Moose Jaw will open its doors for its grand opening. The Kinsman Cafe is a cafe that employs adults with disabilities to ensure they feel included and gain meaningful employment experience. Mr. Speaker, the cafe is run by Moose Jaw Families for Change, a local non-profit organization that works with adults with disabilities in both residential and community settings. Every year, the staff at Moose Jaw Families for Change sits down with its clients and asks them about their goals and aspirations. From these meetings, a theme emerged. All the clients wanted to have a job, as many of the clients have never worked before. Mr. Speaker, the staff began thinking of what they could do, and with the majority of their clients expressing interest in the food service industry, the idea of opening a cafe came quickly to mind. Having the opportunity to contribute to the community gives the workers a stronger sense of inclusion and belonging, and gives them valuable job skills that will help them with their future jobs. After a successful week of training, the new employees are ready for the grand opening. Good luck to the Kinsman Cafe employees, and I can't wait to stop in for a cup of coffee for myself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And as a member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the start of Agribition. It's an important week for our province and our city. For almost 50 years, people from every part of our province and beyond have marked the Canadian Western Agribition on their calendars. It's an opportunity for Saskatchewan's agricultural sector to show the world what our producers, manufacturers, innovators, and entrepreneurs have to offer. And as long as Agribition has been part of our city, 4-H has been part of Agribition. Today we're joined by two extraordinary young women who exemplify the importance and value of 4-H to agriculture and to our province. Carly Rumpel just returned from the Youth Agriculture Summit in Brazil. She was selected as a delegate based on her proposal to teach canning classes as a way of minimizing food waste. And she's also been chosen as a future influencer to attend the Grow Canada conference. Last month, her sister Brett Rumpel, who's also here, went to Rome as a 4-H delegate to a World Food Security meeting under the United Nations umbrella. In 2017, she was also one of 4 Canadians chosen to attend the Global Youth Institute hosted by the World Food Prize Foundation. The Rumpel sisters were enrolled early in 4-H, and they have grown into fine leaders here and on the world stage. They are living examples of the spirit of agricultural ingenuity that characterizes our province's history. It is this very spirit that 4-H fosters and that Agribition showcases. Please join with me in celebrating the extraordinary achievements of these amazing young women and the Canadian Western Agribition.
As a member for Last Mountain Touchwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last Friday, I, along with 500 other people, crammed into the Belcaires Hall to pay tribute to Dwight Dixon. Dwight unexpectedly passed away on November the 14th, leaving behind his wife Lois, his son Jay, his daughter Michelle, and their families, which included 5 grandchildren who were certainly the apple of his eye. Dwight could be certainly called a community person, since he served his community in numerous ways. He served on town council for some 34 years, 16 as mayor. He was an active member of the Belcaires Lions Club for over 35 years. Over the years, I would stop occasionally at Chatterson Lumber, which Dwight and his family owned and operated, and we'd chat about a wide range of topics. He certainly had great insight and very solid opinions, Mr. Speaker, on the items that we discussed, and I will certainly miss those conversations. I think, Mr. Speaker, we can all learn something from Dwight's life, whether it be hard work, determination, and selfless service. Mr. Speaker, I would now ask all members of the Assembly to pay tribute to Dwight Dixon and his family. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
But as a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, while often taken for granted, the air we breathe has an impact on our health every day. At the beginning of November, it was announced that November is National Radon Action Month. With November also being Lung Cancer Month, the pairing was a natural fit. This month of recognition helps remind Saskatchewan people that both lifestyle choices and environmental factors have significant impacts on the health of our lungs. Radon is the leading cause of cancer among non-smokers in Canada. Unfortunately, this gas that is extremely prevalent in Saskatchewan and Manitoba can't be seen, tasted, or smelt. It is important to raise awareness about the risks of radon and to make sure that Saskatchewan residents know that the only way to determine radon levels is to test for them. The Lung Association has teamed up with Andrew Green of the Saskatchewan Roughriders alumni and Adam Bighill of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to be the ambassadors for Radon Action Month. They are encouraging everyone to get their houses and workplaces tested. It is easy and inexpensive, and you can get your test by contacting the Lung Association. I ask all members to join me in thanking the Lung Association for their continued work and dedication to this cause and their efforts in preventing lung cancer in Saskatchewan.
As a member for Regina Rochdale.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to stand today to inform the House that a University of Regina research team was awarded a $3 million grant to help dementia patients in rural Saskatchewan. Over the next 5 years, the researchers will put resources into services for people with dementia or their care partners. The intervention to enhance social inclusion of older adults with dementia in Saskatchewan project will be led by Dr. Jeffries, Dr. McIntosh, and Dr. Novick. Mr. Speaker, this grant will allow researchers to work to improve the lives of older adults living with dementia in small cities and rural communities in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, in Saskatchewan, it is estimated that 20,000 people are living with dementia, and that number only takes into account diagnosed cases. The research team will work with community, businesses, and organizations to develop policies and practices that will help those with dementia. The researchers say the project will help people assess their diagnosis and provide communities tools to develop a framework to engage those living with dementia, to break down the stigma and help build dementia-friendly spaces. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
As a member for Carrot River Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the 49th Annual Canadian Western Agribition kicked off with a historic burning of the brand ceremony. Agribition is the largest livestock show in Canada and also a place for the whole family to take in entertainment featuring live music, shopping, food, pro rodeo, and even pro motocross. Truly fun for the whole family, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, Agribition played host to over 1,250 international guests from 86 countries. Last year, Agribition had an economic impact of more than $73.6 million on not only the City of Regina, but our province as a whole. This year, we are happy to announce another intake of mentees into the 18-month mentorship experience through the Next Gen Agriculture Mentorship Program. This program was formed through a partnership between the Ministry of Agriculture and Canadian Western Agribition. This program aims to create a community of young professionals who will gain a deeper understanding of agriculture and leadership in the industry. This year also marks the third annual charity challenge between the CEO of Agribition and our Minister of Agriculture, with the proceeds going to Stars Air Ambulance. Mr. Speaker, I have a feeling the MLA for Wood River will give Chris a run for his money this year. I look forward to another successful Agribition, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to highlight the work of one of my young constituents. Nate Bergen is a grade 11 student from Holy Rosary High School in Lloydminster, who was recently chosen as one of the 12 high school students to sit on the Ministry of Education's Provincial Youth Council. The Provincial Youth Council is a student-led group that works directly with the Minister of Education to provide leadership and direction on how best to engage students in academics. Mr. Speaker, Nate is very involved with the community, between curling, volunteering at Sandy Beach Community Camp, and raising money for mental health at the Lloydminster Health Foundation Gala, Project Sunrise. His biography also adds that he's committed to recognizing and respecting diversity among students and is interested in helping make positive changes for all students. Mr. Speaker, Nate is also a very strong student. In fact, he received honor roll with great distinction in grades 8, 9, and 10. With a resume like that, Mr. Speaker, I just know that Nate will have all kinds of ideas on how to improve our province's education, and I know Nate is looking forward to sharing his ideas with the Minister on the future of student-focused education in this province. Mr. Speaker, I now invite all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Nate Bergen on his incredible accomplishments and for being chosen to sit on this committee. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start today's question period on a point of agreement, a point of common ground. Everyone in this legislature is deeply concerned about the CN rail strike. All of us want to see rail workers back to work, and I know that's what they want to see as well. All of us are concerned about getting Saskatchewan products, Saskatchewan oil and gas, potash, grain, back on track, getting back to market. But we also all believe and all share a desire to see the public protected and to see workers have safe work conditions. It's on that latter point that I wish to press the Premier. I'm wondering why he would choose to pressure the federal government to legislate these folks back to work rather than be pressuring the federal government to enact safety regulations that would protect workers and the public, and why he isn't pressuring CN to negotiate a fair deal.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, in the absence of the Premier, I'll be taking that question on behalf of the government. Our interest as a province, of course, is that rail service be resumed as soon as possible. And I'm glad to hear the Leader of the Opposition has a similar position. And I would say as well, Mr. Speaker, of course, we acknowledge that safety be of top concern for workers. I would also note, Mr. Speaker, though we're already starting to see the economic impacts of this rail stoppage. Just this morning, Nutrien announced 550 layoffs and the shuttering of the Rocanville mine. We have economic estimates that this strike will cost the Canadian economy over $1 billion a week. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we well know that those economic impacts fall disproportionately on Western Canada. Rail service is essential to our economy, whether it be to potash, whether it be to energy, whether it be to agricultural commodities. That's why we've called for rail service to be resumed as quickly as possible, ideally through a negotiated agreement, but binding arbitration or legislative action if necessary.
Good answer. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the common ground that we share. We are all concerned about the concerns of agricultural producers in this province after a very difficult harvest. We're all concerned to hear about the shutdown of potash mining at this point. This is a very big concern. And at this point, we need to be uniting people, not pitting them one against the other, not pitting farmers and miners against the workers who are here with us today, Mr. Speaker. CN is the company that never prioritizes getting Saskatchewan grain to market. CN is the company that never prioritizes getting our potash to market. CN is the company that has been unwilling to establish safe conditions for workers and safety for the public, Mr. Speaker. If this government is going to pick sides, why would they choose to pick the side of a multi-billion-dollar company that has never put Saskatchewan's interests first and force us towards back-to-work legislation instead of working alongside Saskatchewan workers to ensure public safety at the same time as we get our products to market?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're standing with the interest of this province. And the interests of this province are that rail service be resumed as quickly as possible. And, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the economic impacts already. 550 layoffs announced this morning, the closing down of an entire potash mine. Mr. Speaker, of course, we see workplace safety as being an absolute priority. It's something of top concern. We need, though, to have this rail service restored. Ideally, Mr. Speaker, that will be through a negotiated agreement agreed to by both Labour and by the company in question. But, Mr. Speaker, if we can't get a negotiated agreement, we need to have that rail service resumed, whether that be through binding arbitration, Mr. Speaker, which is a possibility under federal statute, or whether that be legislative options as well.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other day, the member for Saskatoon Fairview and I joined some of these workers on the picket line to hear their stories. We had one worker tell us that he's driving mile-long bombs through our cities and towns. That the danger to our communities when you've got someone who's driving, who's fatigued, who's exhausted to the point of impairment, that they're afraid of what that will do for the workers and for the public, Mr. Speaker. Meeting with workers, going down to talk to folks on the line is extremely important. I don't know if that's something the minister has done in the past, but I'm asking him today, given that he's the one answering the questions, will he sit down with the workers who've joined us in the House today and hear their concerns and understand the full story?
Hear, hear. Hear. Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I would take some issue with the characterization by the Leader of the Opposition with referring to trains as a mile-long bomb, Mr. Speaker. If the Leader of the Opposition is really concerned about the movement of oil by rail, there's an answer to that, Mr. Speaker, and it's called pipelines. And the Leader of the Opposition has repeatedly opposed the construction of new pipelines, Mr. Speaker. That being said, our interest as a province, Mr. Speaker, is that we have this rail service restored as quickly as possible. This is clearly in the economic interest of our province, in the economic interest of our potash mines, in the economic interest of our energy companies, in the economic interest of our farmers. We need to have this rail service restored as quickly as possible. Ideally, this will be done through the collective bargaining process. If an agreement can't be reached, Mr. Speaker, then, yes, we would support either binding arbitration or back-to-work legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another point of agreement, another point of common ground. We agree that the safest way to transport oil is through pipelines. Hear, hear. But that the reality of the day is that most of that oil is traveling by train. And these folks are identifying a very significant risk as a result of that. My question for the minister, once again, it's a very simple question. Will he take his comments and concerns out of this place and actually meet with the workers today?
Good question.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Exports.
Speaker, firstly, we're happy to sit down with the leadership of the folks that are here today. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? The safest way to transport energy, oil, is by pipeline. And the Leader of the Opposition and those members opposite, the member for Athabasca, the member for Rosemont, have stood up and voted against the construction of new pipelines in this country every time they have gotten the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Their federal leader just ran an entire national...
Order, please. Member for Rosemont, it's unparliamentary. Recognize the minister, and please stay with the question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Talking about pipelines, as that was the preamble to the Leader of the Opposition's questions. Their national leader just ran an entire federal election campaign opposing the construction of any new pipelines, presumably supported by all of those members opposite, including the Leader of the Opposition, who was out campaigning and door-knocking for that member, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we see the need for rail service to be restored as rapidly as possible and call on the parties involved.
Next question. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a 10-year-old girl took her own life last Thursday in a community west of Meadow Lake. This was the third suicide at Makwasagagan First Nation in the last 3 weeks. Previously, a 14-year-old child and a young father. The community is in crisis, and Chief Ronald Mitswing has declared a state of emergency and called on all levels of government to act urgently to support the community in this time of need. Sadly, we know the residents of Makwasagagan are not alone. This is a problem all across our province, and in particular, northern communities have been hardest hit. The suicide rate for First Nations people in our province is 4 times that of the rest of the population. For First Nations girls, it's 29 times non-First Nations girls. Mr. Speaker, what is this government going to do immediately to address the unacceptable rates of suicide in our province?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, suicide is certainly a tragedy. It's even a greater loss when we experience it with a child. And certainly, when I reached out to the community, I expressed certainly on the government's part our sympathies and condolences to the loss for family, friends, and the residents of the community of Makwa. Mr. Speaker, part of the services that we are providing is emergency services, and we've asked, and SHA has offered, to provide mental health and addiction staff trained in suicide risk assessment in helping provide assessments to the residents and especially the children of the community of Makwa area to make sure that they've got the supports that they need. And those supports were offered this morning and will be offered throughout the weeks going forward. Mr. Speaker, we've also had offers from the Ministry of Social Services. They've been in contact with the Meadow Lake Tribal Council through their Child and Family Services agency to get the support of CBOs in the area, and they have provided support if the First Nation requests, and we've continued to.
Next question. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Magwa-Sagagan is hurting, and it was entirely preventable. Community after community across this province has been torn apart by grief over the loss of young people where help wasn't there in their time of need. More than 2,200 people have died by suicide in Saskatchewan since 2005. Families are hurting, they're looking for answers, and they're hearing nothing from this government, Mr. Speaker. They're looking for action. Provinces that have implemented suicide prevention strategies have seen significant drops in the number of suicide, in particular youth suicide, Mr. Speaker. That's why my colleague, the member for Cumberland, who has been to far too many funerals for his constituents, that's why this session he once again introduced legislation calling on the government to implement a suicide prevention strategy for Saskatchewan. The Premier has let this legislation die on the order paper already once. Will he show us today that he's heard the pleas from Magwa-Sagagan and other communities and work with us to address this issue by passing this Saskatchewan Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act this session, or will he continue to be missing in action on this important file?
As the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, I don't think anyone in this House has had the exclusivity of not being affected by the effects of suicide, whether with young people or with adults. And as my colleague, the Minister of Health, has indicated previously in this House, we've asked the Ministry of Health to complete a jurisdictional scan to look at what other provinces have implemented for suicide strategies and see if there are any gaps between the services that they've provided within those provinces, as well as what we've had in our approach. Mr. Speaker, in our approach, we've got the 2014 10-year Mental Health and Addictions Action Plan, and that's what we're basing our activities and initiatives going forward in, Mr. Speaker. What we found as well throughout the country, that 9 out of 13 provinces and territories have suicide prevention mental health addictions plans that are dating back to within 10 years. Mr. Speaker, these documents all have a variety of names: calling action plans, strategies, plans, reports, and initiatives. We're going to continue to work forward in looking at the gaps that may be out there in services being offered, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, the status quo is not good enough. We would urge the minister to support this legislation. Mr. Speaker, World Diabetes Day was earlier this month. Despite provincial diabetes rates continuing to climb and having among the highest rates of morbidity from diabetes in the country, Saskatchewan isn't doing as much as other provinces to support the nearly 100,000 people living with diabetes. Unlike Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and the Territories, people living with type 1 diabetes in Saskatchewan lose support for insulin pumps when they turn 26 years old. Is the minister aware of the incredibly burdensome costs this can impose on families, and what is the plan to better support people in Saskatchewan living with diabetes?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am aware of the high rate of diabetes in this province, Mr. Speaker. I have a number of people in my own family that suffer from it. In fact, a family member that just told me last week that they've been diagnosed. Mr. Speaker, we recognize how important this is. Ministry of Health and Saskatchewan Health Authority have taken a number of steps over the years, including education, Mr. Speaker. We do have the diabetes pump program that the member opposite referred to, Mr. Speaker. Every year during the budget process, we revisit programs and consider whether programs should be increased or expanded, Mr. Speaker. That obviously will be one of them in the mix. But, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work hard to help people with diabetes in this province.
And as a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan is lagging behind yet again. Today we're joined by Paul Kaspira and his mother, Lynn Eichel. Paul has type 1 diabetes and uses an insulin pump to manage his care. Unfortunately, when Paul turned 26, he lost eligibility for a new pump under provincial coverage. This left him in a position where he would need to pay more than $7,000 for a replacement, and he has been advocating for this to change. Paul and Lynn are calling on this government to follow other provinces and expand insulin pump coverage for all patients with type 1 diabetes in this province who need it. To the minister, does he recognize diabetes doesn't go away when you're 26, and will he commit to reviewing this policy today?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, if they so wish, I'd be happy to meet with our visitors in the gallery today after question period. I'd love to discuss it with them. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, we have a diabetes pump program, Mr. Speaker. We have educational programs. We certainly try to assist people wherever possible. But, Mr. Speaker, I take exception just to the tone of the question, Mr. Speaker. It was this government that increased the age for diabetes pumps from 18 to 26.
As a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That minister knows that this government has also made cuts, including to the coverage of testing strips for folks with diabetes in this province in 2015. Mr. Speaker, the minister knows there are savings from preventative care, and the risks of people being unable to afford pumps or supplies will only cost our health system more in acute and emergency settings. That's right. Nationwide, nearly $80 million are spent treating diabetes every day. These costs are mitigated by savings and benefits from people like Paul having access to supplies and equipment that help to keep them healthy. Does the minister recognize that a $7,000 cost isn't manageable for most people in the province, and will he commit to covering the cost of insulin pumps for people living with type 1 diabetes today?
Here, here. Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government certainly does recognize the benefits of preventative medicine, Mr. Speaker, right across the board in healthcare, Mr. Speaker. That's why a number of years ago we did increase the age for insulin pumps from 18 to 26, Mr. Speaker. As I said, during the budget process, we frequently look at all types of programs. Mr. Speaker, a former finance minister in this government, Rod Gantifor, used to talk about when you develop new programs or enhance existing programs, that it would be easy if it was a case of good program versus bad. But frequently, Mr. Speaker, it's a case of deciding which good program you need to fund or which good program you need to expand. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'd be pleased to meet with the guests in the gallery and have a discussion with them. Mr. Speaker, we do take the issue of diabetes extremely seriously.
As a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, public employees in this province are worried about coming forward as whistleblowers. The Public Interest Disclosure Commissioner has reason to believe that government employees do not feel safe coming forward to her office with complaints of wrongdoing. Numerous brown envelopes anonymously delivered to her office suggest the process for coming forward is broken. Last week, we called on the government to expand whistleblower protections to include employees of the Saskatchewan Health Authority. It's clear this legislation needs improving, and this is a great place to start. To the Minister of Justice, when will healthcare workers in Saskatchewan have protections to blow the whistle on the crisis in our hospitals?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had this discussion on the floor of the Assembly for over a week now, I think, Mr. Speaker. There was a memo that we said from the start that was poorly worded, Mr. Speaker, but it was never an attempt by this government. There's never been direction by this government in any way, shape, or form, Mr. Speaker, to muzzle employees of the SHA. The Leader of the Opposition was saying that we were trying to muzzle doctors, Mr. Speaker. Nothing could be further from the truth. I meet with doctors frequently. I meet with and get correspondence from Saskatchewan Health Authority employees frequently, Mr. Speaker. Nobody's attempting to muzzle them. And, Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that employees already have internal channels to report issues through their collective agreements and occupational health and safety processes.
Recognize a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, my question was about legislation, which has been an issue that's been on the Minister of Justice's radar for some time. Years ago, the Minister of Justice, then in my role as critic for justice, said in a Sask Party leaflet that the protections for whistleblowers in Saskatchewan at the time were too little and too narrow. He introduced a private member's bill that would have extended whistleblower protections to employees of the health authorities. Yet, as a cabinet minister for over a decade, he's done nothing to ensure healthcare workers are protected by whistleblower legislation. When can we expect the Sask Party to finally table legislation to give healthcare workers whistleblower protection?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition then will be thrilled with this response today. Mr. Speaker, I've had a number of discussions both with the Justice Minister's office, also with the Public Service Commissioner, Minister responsible for. Mr. Speaker, officials in Justice tell me that while the existing whistleblower legislation or the Public Interest Disclosure Act for provincial employees is not a perfect fit for Saskatchewan Healthcare Authority employees, Mr. Speaker, that simply by regulation instead of by legislation, we will be able to cover Saskatchewan Health Authority employees under that legislation, Mr. Speaker. That work is already underway. We expect it to be completed within the next few weeks, and at the same time, Mr. Speaker, so we have an even better fit, they're working on drafting legislation that we will be proposing in the House to cover all healthcare employees in the spring.
As a member for Regina Lakeview.
Well, one decent answer. Let's try again, Mr. Speaker. Last week, we asked the Education Minister about the Premier's broken promise.
Order, please. Recognize the member.
Mr. Speaker, last week we asked the Education Minister about the Premier's broken promise to hire 400 additional educational assistants. The Minister kept repeating that the funding was equivalent of 400 EAs. The exact words of the budget announcement say this about that $30 million funding. This will allow school divisions to continue to support students in the classroom by maintaining or hiring up to 400 teachers and other in-school professionals. Even the government press release, Mr. Speaker, contradicts that minister's version. So, can the minister explain why the Sask Party broke a promise to hire 400 or more EAs?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the words that the member just spoke underscore promise that was made, Mr. Speaker. It will allow school divisions to hire up to 400 EAs. That's what we said, Mr. Speaker. The $30 million pledge that the Premier had made that was in that budget, Mr. Speaker, is given to the school divisions unconditionally, Mr. Speaker. That could have allowed the school divisions, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to hire 400 EAs, Mr. Speaker. But the funds that are provided to school divisions are provided unconditionally, Mr. Speaker. Now, last week I asked, Mr. Speaker, if it's a position of the opposition that they'd like to take the unconditionality off the funding that we provide in our budget, Mr. Speaker, they should need to stand up and say that. Because there isn't one trustee in the province of Saskatchewan that thinks that's a good idea. And there's two trustees, Mr. Speaker, two former trustees sitting over there, Mr. Speaker, who wouldn't think that taking the unconditionality off funding to the school divisions is a good idea.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't about conditionality. This is about adequacy, and he knows that. The minister can't continue to blame boards, Mr. Speaker, for his government's failures. This is a government that has undermined school board autonomy time and time again.
That's right.
They cut millions from our classrooms and stripped school board autonomy with Bill 63, a bill that came on the heels of a devastating $54 million cut to growing classrooms. It's no wonder that the minister confuses his number and statements, because none of it bears even a passing resemblance to what is going on in our classrooms today.
Shame.
If the Premier knew that he couldn't keep his promise to hire 400 EAs, Mr. Speaker, why did he make it in the first place?
Hear, hear.
And as the Minister of Education.
Speaker, the Premier of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, promised $30 million in the budget, which is the equivalent of 400 EAs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the school divisions choose to spend that money that's given to them unconditionally on EAs, Mr. Speaker, that's completely up to them, Mr. Speaker. And a number of school divisions did retain EAs, Mr. Speaker, as a result of that budget increase. A number of them didn't, Mr. Speaker. But the promise was $30 million, which was the equivalent, Mr. Speaker. That allowed school divisions to do that if they so choose, Mr. Speaker. Some of those school divisions chose not to do that, Mr. Speaker. I wish the member opposite would stop playing politics with the children in our classroom, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the work that we're doing on this, Mr. Speaker, it's nothing but politics for them. Mr. Speaker, we continue to work, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House in the best interests of the people of this province, the children in our classroom, Mr. Speaker, and that's what the people of this province can expect from this government.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 195 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting.
Item number 2, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 196 be now introduced and read a first time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall this bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
With leave immediately, Mr. Speaker.
Somebody please shut his microphone off. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 44, asked by Ms. Chartier.
I recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 44 to 53.
Ordered 44 to 53.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 174, the Enforcement and Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for John Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor today to join in the debate around Bill 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act. This bill does several things, mainly updating some language throughout the Act. It also clarifies or makes it clear that Banking information can be demanded, although I believe this is already standard practice. I think it's just making sure that that's actually clear in the legislation. It also updates section references to this legislation to what's in the Workers' Compensation Act and allows for email service being provided, which is already allowed in the Queen's Bench rules, Mr. Speaker. So based on my understanding of the legislation, my reading of it, it's largely updating provisions, making clear what is already existent in common practice. I'm going to be asking several questions like those to members of the ministry and so that I can do that, I am prepared to, at this time, allow this bill to move forward to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the minister, by the member that Bill number 174 be now read a second time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
This bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 176, the Fiduciaries Access to Digital Information Act. Mr. Peterson.
Recognize the member for John Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, it's my honour to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 176, the Fiduciaries Access to Digital Information Act. This bill does several things. It determines the conditions under which the fiduciary may have access and manage the digital assets of their clients. It also establishes that the duties of the fiduciary regarding digital assets are not different of those related to tangible personal property. It further outlines the duties of the fiduciary and determines that a fiduciary has the right to require access to digital assets in case these later are managed by a custodian. It determines that the right of access of the fiduciary is subject to any restriction set out in the will of the deceased owner, and it provides protection against liability for custodians who provide access in accordance with this Act. Mr. Speaker, there's a few questions about, and what I'm curious about are what are some examples of digital assets and what that in fact means, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if that includes email records or social media accounts. I think there's a few questions about that and how that relates into the responsibilities of a power of attorney or a fiduciary, as it's called in this legislation, Mr. Speaker. I think there'll be some questions around that and what that looks like in other jurisdictions. I know, obviously, we're a society that's evolving and moving more and more digital. As such, we own digitally quite a few things that, when we're not able to, when we require a fiduciary for whatever reason we're incapacitated, there needs to be some avenue to be able to. For the person who is looking over our assets to be able to take control of those assets. But there is several questions as to what that actually looks like and what sort of powers that individual has and how that works with the various digital companies, so to speak. Mr. Speaker, I'm curious about this area. It's quite a new area. Usually when we were thinking about back in the day, 7 to 8 years ago when I was drafting wills and powers of attorney. Even then, we weren't really giving a lot of thought to digital assets in particular. Of course, we were thinking about bank accounts, but that's not a digital asset, Mr. Speaker. We weren't really thinking about email records as an example, or perhaps some other records, or bitcoins is another example. Perhaps that's some sort of digital asset that some individuals need protecting. I don't have any bitcoins, so I don't really. I often forget that is a potential digital asset for those who have a bit more finances than I do. Mr. Speaker. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion with officials on the justice end. I'm looking forward to that committee and asking these questions, and to facilitate that discussion, I'm prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 176 be now read a second time. Pleasure, Assembly, to adopt the motion. Carried.
This bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Deputy Government.
There, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 176, the Fiduciaries Access to Digital Information Act, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act. In summation, Mr. Speaker, this legislation is amending a very large amount of different types of legislation to allow for their various registers, which their list of members, Mr. Speaker, to be done electronically or to be accessible electronically rather than a physical copy of a register, Mr. Speaker. This is similar to what we see in the legal profession, where you can go onto the Law Society website and Google different names and see people's statuses and see if they're registered or not. This is allowing, for example, the accounting profession, the architects, the chiropractors, dietitians. That's just to name a couple of the legislation of the group's legislations that are being amended in this regard. I do want to highlight one piece of correspondence we've received. I know that the Minister of Justice has received this as well because it was directed to him, but I thankfully was also CC'd to this, and it's a letter from the Privacy Commissioner who just wanted to indicate that he was pleased to see that these amendments were coming forward. However, he is encouraging that we consider actually expanding this and providing that citizens can easily access, for example, whether an individual has been suspended by their professional body and for how long, or whether any complaints have been made against this individual, whether an individual's license has been revoked, and whether that individual has had other discipline proceedings in the past, to allow for a greater amount of transparency and accessibility for the public, Mr. Speaker, which is what I think this legislation is intending to provide. Like I said already, the Privacy Commissioner is supportive of this legislation, but is encouraging that we consider expanding it. So I'm looking forward to having that discussion with officials at committee. And to facilitate that, at this time I'm prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 177 be now read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act. This bill isn't very lengthy. It just repeals several acts. They are the Family and Community Services Act, the Veterinary Services Act, the Water Appeal Board Act, and then a few private acts, which include an act to incorporate International Bible College, an act to incorporate Le Soeur de Notre-Dame de la Croix, an act to incorporate Prince Albert Exhibition Association, and an act to incorporate the Regina Exhibition Association Limited. Mr. Speaker, I'm assuming these are essentially defunct bills at this time, or acts at this time, and therefore no longer need to be around. Happy to see the ministry doing this work and cleaning up legislation that needs cleaning up. So at this point, I am prepared to allow Bill 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act, to move on to the next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 178 be now read a second time. Pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice. Again.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to join in on Bill 179, the Apiaries Amendment Act 2019. Getting into it, it's about honeybees. I talked to my colleague who does and you know, has spent quite a bit of time with honeybees, and that I guess for him maybe a hobby. Maybe it's more than a hobby to him, but he's very he articulates well. He's passionate about it, and he's kind of educated me listening to him talk about it a little bit. And I know he refers, bees are important, and the honeybee is very important to our food supply. It's a process that's taken. Obviously, the kids take it up in school, and it's important as we explain to our kids about bees, honeybees. But I also remind my grandkids when I'm showing them bees can protect themselves pretty good too, so you have to be careful with that. But this was, we're talking about open feeding and stuff like that. I'm not going to act like I have a good understanding of it like he does, but I know my colleagues, and there'll be a time for him and with a few of them to find out, you know, exactly why, who's called on for this legislation changes. There's obviously a purpose and a reason, somebody asked, but I know they'll reach out and they'll try to talk to those individuals that would be impacted. You know, does this make sense? Is there any changes need to be done? Is there any improvements we can do in legislation? And I know as a critic, they'll reach out and they'll talk. So there's going to be opportunity for those individuals, Mr. Speaker, to bring concerns forward if there are any, or questions that they may have, or from the minister. So at this time, I don't have a lot more questions. I know in committee, my colleagues will have more questions, but there'll be work to be done in committee. But you know, when I was thinking about important legislation, and this, Mr. Speaker, might be important legislation. But having said that, there are pieces of legislation that we know and we're hoping to see more good work, but obviously the government, you know, is kind of tired, I guess, maybe. And, you know, so we're waiting for the type of legislation that's important and very important to the people of our good province. And there are different ones, and I mean, whether it's members with private bills that are coming forward, or legislation that people are asking this government or asking the opposition, you know, for the government to bring forward. So I'm hoping that the government, you know, will be introducing legislation that is meaningful to the people of this good province to deal with some serious issues. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I think they're old, tired, and, you know, out of ideas. And hopefully, Mr. Speaker, someday the people of our good province will send that government a message. And we'll work hard to make sure we help the people send that government a message. So I don't want to take a lot of time, Mr. Speaker. I just was trying to explain back and forth how it is. So at this time, I'm prepared to adjourn Bill 179.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 7, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 180, miscellaneous statutes, government relations, transfer of gas, electrical and plumbing functions, Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 180, the miscellaneous statutes, government relations, transfer of gas, electrical and plumbing functions, Amendment Act 2019. So if this bill is passed, it will implement the government's decision to transfer responsibility for gas, electrical and plumbing licensing and inspection to TSASC, the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan. The goal here is to transfer all the responsibilities of licensing, permitting, and inspecting functions of TSASC starting in 2020. And there's a number of comments that the minister made in his second reading speech, outlining a little bit about TSASC as a nonprofit corporation. We know they regulate right now licensing, permitting, and inspection services for industries that deal with boilers, pressure vessels, elevators, and amusement rides. And I had the pleasure of learning a little bit about this in their licensing of escalators in public accounts, Mr. Speaker. So had some occasion to interact with these folks a little bit. The main question that I have about the bill as presented is what consultation took place and what the implications are going to be for this change. It sounds like a great deal of responsibility that is moving onto the backs of TSASC, so I wonder about their capacity to manage this licensing and what the rationale is behind the change. So that's definitely what comes to mind for myself, Mr. Speaker. We know that this is an important piece of legislation. We will be looking through it carefully and reviewing it and making sure that our critic has a look at it as well. But with that, I will move that we adjourn debate on this bill for today.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 181, Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
I thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to enter into the debate today on these yet again more changes to the Mineral Taxation Act. Mr. Speaker, this act has been amended more times than others for sure, and in fact it was amended in 2017, 2018, 2019, and it's up again this year for yet a second round of amendments. So lots of changes coming through from the Ministry of Energy and Resources and making changes to the way that mineral taxes are recovered here in Saskatchewan. It seems, a quick review here, that most of the changes are moving procedural stuff from the bill, from the legislation itself, and into the regulatory sphere, Mr. Speaker. This is referred to throughout in the explanatory notes as modernization, and the claim is that this is to conform with modern legislative and regulatory drafting standards, which have been established in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. But once again, as I am wont to say in this Assembly, is every time the scrutiny from this chamber is taken away and moved away over to the Executive Council, that's a reason to be concerned, Mr. Speaker, and I think we have to be careful not to allow Executive Council more power than this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and that, I think, is what you find in this bill, is a whole bunch of these legislative provisions that were deemed to be appropriate by this legislature in the past are now being replaced with the claim of consistency with modern drafting standards. I hope that's not a euphemism for something else, Mr. Speaker, but a whole bunch of this is moving that system over to regulations. If I understand correctly, one of the ways that's being changed is the way mineral titles, the area of mineral titles are being determined. That's being moved into the regulations. And that, I know, has been a thorn in the side of the folks over in Energy and Resources who are trying to do proper calculations when it comes to extent. And so hopefully this will make the changes they need to be able to determine that. And there's definitely other changes in terms of the mineral production tax rate and the ownership of the mineral titles. Again, there's great uncertainty in the ownership of mineral titles, Mr. Speaker, given some unfortunate practices that evolved in the land title system in the 1940s, 50s, 60s when mineral titles weren't given much attention by land titles registrars. So I assume these are changes that are going to clarify ownership, particularly in areas where there is uncertainty as to ownership. I think one of the examples is in the Prince Albert settlement. I was just looking at the map, Mr. Speaker, in the original map of the Prince Albert settlement, where there was a number, almost 100 of these long, narrow river lots, which all added up to 160 acres, but you can see in the map they were long stretches of land rather than your traditional quarter section. And the member from PA Northcote is now living at what was formerly River Lot 73. We found that out by doing a historical title search. And in the Prince Albert settlement, when the surface, as you can imagine, as it became a city, started getting subdivided, and then there was streets and lanes and lots and blocks and individual homes on those river lots. One of the things that got left behind in the land titles registry was who owned the minerals underneath those river lots, because they were all, because of the time the river lots were granted back in the late 1800s, the minerals weren't being reserved to the Crown. So you can imagine the number of situations in Prince Albert. For every lot and block in Prince Albert, there could be an issue as to the mineral title. And certainly I think there won't be a lot of exploitation of minerals on 6th Avenue in Prince Albert, because you can't exploit minerals in a city area, but it's the idea that those minerals were left behind as Prince Albert developed as a city. So always very interesting to think about things like that. At any rate, Mr. Speaker, we do have a lot of questions about this bill, and we need to ensure that it's creating certainty and whether this precision will actually meet the requirements of the objectives of the drafters. And so at this point, I'm moving that we will, others will want to comment it, so I'll move that we adjourn the debate on Bill number 181.
The member from Saskatoon-Nutana has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 181, the Mineral Taxation Modernization Amendment Act 2019. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Moving from mineral taxation to marriage. It's quite a leap, but we'll do what we can and see how it goes. This bill in the Marriage Act, I know a number of my colleagues have already had an opportunity to comment on it. It just it seems a bit strange, Mr. Speaker, this bill, and I think about some of the family disputes that I'm aware of where children of one elderly person are pitted against children of another elderly person, different families. These people find love in their later years and decide to hitch their wagon to each other, and then the next thing you know, there's disputes from the children about who should be administering their estates, and all kinds of troubles can ensue, and it becomes a very nasty matter for some families. And I've seen that, I've heard about that, Mr. Speaker, and for the government to intervene at this point and try and straighten that out, they may be walking into a viper's pit, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure I'd want to be the government official that's trying to sort these disputes out with these complicated family matters that sometimes happen when spouses get remarried with children involved in both of the former marriages. So seniors being taken advantage of, Mr. Speaker, is a really serious issue. I believe this is what the government's trying to get at in this bill. Not sure that these legislative changes will exactly get to that. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as you know, there's always two sides to a story. So if one family thinks their loved one is being taken advantage by the other side of the family, I can almost assure you that that would be the same story coming from the other side. And these matters are really complicated, as I said, and full of pitfalls, Mr. Speaker, and I think definitely that's a role for the courts to help with the intervention when these disputes arise. So I think we need to be very careful about rushing into legislation like this. And whether you're looking after someone or taking advantage of them is a very fine line, Mr. Speaker, or it can be, and certainly is subject to interpretation from the other side of the dispute. So I think we're worried about those kinds of interventions legislatively when it comes to those kinds of family disputes that are so difficult, Mr. Speaker. Strange to see the government intervening at this time. The timing seems quite fortuitous, I would say, but we definitely want to take a close look at this and talk to people, find out who the government consulted with. It's weird to amend wills or actually annul wills through a legislative enactment like this, and it is a very major change, I think, in terms of wills and marriage. So we do want to have an opportunity to speak to other people, consult with the folks that work in this area, Mr. Speaker, and certainly talk to families who have been ripped apart by the existing law or by the existing situations where allegations of abuse on one side or the other or both have to be sorted through, and unfortunately sometimes criminal charges can be laid and it gets really messy, Mr. Speaker. So this is definitely something we'll want to take a look at, and I know other people are going to weigh in on this as well. So at this point I will move to amend debate on Bill number 175. Amend debate.
The member from Saskatoon-Nutana has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 175. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
I recognize from Prince Albert, Northcote.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, like always, it's a great pleasure to join in with regards to adding my my comments on debate with the changes to Bill number 183, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Act 2019. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've said before and I'll say again that in this role you learn a lot of things that you didn't know that you were going to learn about in life, and one of these was reading about the Fisheries Act. I read quite a few media articles and some background information on regards to some of the issues and fines and situations with regards to fishing within our province. I have to admit that I'm not much of an outdoorsman, so I don't do a whole lot of fishing and reluctantly go camping every year because the family makes me. But this year, my brother also made me go fishing because he believed that due to the stressful work environment we have, he felt that it would be really good for me to be out there, and apparently it's relaxing, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I have a hard time relaxing, and I don't slow down very easily, and so we enjoyed our company, and he taught me a lot about fishing. He had actually quite a successful fishing year this year. My brother, he goes out all summer long, and they spend a lot of time at Waskesiu, which is beautiful up there. But my knowledge on regards to fishing in our province is very minimal, Mr. Deputy Speaker, so I will not pretend I know a whole lot about this particular file. But when I was doing some research with regards to the amendments of this bill, it looks like it has been time to make some changes here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because it's been about 25 years since this piece of legislation was updated. And so we know with regards to times and the changes within our language, and it's important to modernize our pieces of legislation. And so some of the changes with regards to here add some new definitions with regards to the fisheries area, and it also. Actually, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's a lot of changes within this piece of legislation, and so it's going to need to be evaluated in quite detail. So I'll say a few key points of what's going to be changed. There's going to be an increase of authority to respond quickly and efficiently. There's also some development of environmental code chapters. The minister, there's a lot of authorization for the minister with regards to this piece of legislation. So I think a lot of that will be important to question and see who was responsible prior to these changes in this legislation, because I often feel that allowing the minister sometimes a bit too much authority could be a slippery slope. So, but some of the things is the minister will have the authority to appoint members of the Fisheries Advisory Committee. They'll have the authority to designate fishery officers. They can appoint advisory committees, and the minister will also have the power to determine the designation of wild species at risk. They'll have the ability to implement a recovery plan to protect endangered species. The minister will be able to establish aquatic invasive species inspection stations. There's a lot of requirements here, and we know fishery officers also have a big role with this as well. And so they have the authority to conduct audits and changes to the procedures around inspections and investigations. I know there'll be some changes to the ability to add provisions to protect provincial aquatic species at risk. There's going to also be some changes to the procedures for insurance and transfer of license, changes to procedures regarding the amendment, suspension, or cancellation of licenses. And I believe also there'll be the ability to add some administrative penalties with regards to if people, there isn't anything you could take from them, but if there should be a financial consequence to their action, that there'll be the abilities to have these administrative penalties implemented. And so, so like I said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation. It protects our water, protects our aquatic species at risk, and so if this piece of legislation could be more evidence-based, results-based, and we'll make sure that our waters and our aquatic species are protected, that should be of utmost importance to us. So, we'll carefully review the changes within this piece of legislation. I know the critic will also be meeting with stakeholders and anyone who may feel that they want to have give some advice with regards to the changes here, and I have some other colleagues that would like to add their thoughts to this piece of legislation. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill number 183.
The member from Prince Albert Northcote has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 183. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 184, the Fisheries Saskatchewan Consequential Amendments Act 2019. Ms. Chartier.
I once again recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm happy to be able to just add a few little comments with regards to the Consequential Amendments Act. A lot of my comments will be on the previous piece of legislation brought forward, the Fisheries Act 2019, because that's where the bulk of the changes to the legislation is and the information that I was talking to about. So we know with the Consequential Amendments Act, there'll be some updated references and updated definitions and changes, probably reflection with the changes in the Fisheries Act, and there'll be some changes in some bilingual acts as well. So this is just to make sure everything runs smoothly with regards to some of the changes to some of the other acts, amendments to acts like the Wildlife Act and such. And so because these changes are housekeeping in nature, my remarks are few and far between here for this one. And with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to just adjourn debate on Bill number 184.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 184. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 187, the Administration of Estates Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to stand today and enter into the debate on Bill number 187, an act to amend the Administration of Estates Act. And it's a very important piece of legislation. And actually, you know, it's interesting as you prepare for entering into these things, when you read the legislation, how you pick up some tweaks. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but I do want to give a general overview, if I may. And for people at home, this is a pretty important piece of legislation. It's one that we will all have to deal with at some point. When we have an estate, either it will be someone in the a close family member or something. We want to make sure it's all done on the up and up. Some of us may not be the administrator or the executor, but we will want to make sure that there is an appropriate level of fairness and accountability, and that things are done on the up and up, and that the laws are written in such a way that it does promote that. And so I'll take a minute and just reflect, as I quite often do, about what the minister had said back on November 12th when he introduced the bill. And he really talked about how he wanted to amend the act to reflect amendments that will, in the recommended by the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. So it will be, what's interesting that and I have the utmost respect for that office, but I'm just wondering if others were consulted, whether the Bar Association or the Uniform Law Reform Commission were consulted about this, because clearly the administration of estates is one, while we don't talk a lot about it, it's a pretty common thing. We all pass away, and we all have to deal with our wills and our estates. And so if you're looking for input, I would think that most lawyers have had some experience, or the ones that do have a lot of experience probably have some thoughts on it. So I'm curious to know what they would have to say about this administration bill in terms of best practices. What do they see as good ideas? Or what would they recommend? And so clearly I've become, and this is one of the things, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as you would know, that we all, over the course of time, come to learn more about government services. I really didn't know much about the public guardian as a school teacher. Why would I have to know that? And as you do casework in your office, obviously as you're referring people to different services within the public service, I have come to know a little bit more about that. And I think they do good work, and it's very important that we help people navigate their way through the services that are provided by the provincial government. One of the sections that he talks about are the proposed amendments will add a provision providing for the removal of executors or administrators. And he goes on to say the current act allows for the revocation of letters probate or letters of administration. It does not establish a process for the removal of an executor or administrator. And so this sets out clear guidelines. And it's interesting that, and he talks about them, and I'll talk about it too, because I want to refer directly to the Act, and it's on page 6, if anybody at home wants to take notes, and it's a section 14.1, the removal of the executor or the administrator. And on the application of a person having an interest in the estate, the court may remove an executor or administrator if the court is satisfied that A, the executor or administrator, 1, has failed to comply with an order of the court, 2, refuses to administer or settle the estate, 3, has failed to administer the estate in a reasonable or prudent manner, 4, lacks capacity as an executor or administrator, 5, has been convicted of an offense involving dishonesty, or 6, is an undischarged bankruptcy, and B, the removal, and then it goes on, B, the removal of the executor would be in the best interest of the person interested in the estate. Now, Mr. Speaker, that seems like a pretty straightforward situation, but you know, I was just reading the next bill I'm going to be talking about, Bill 189, the Coroners Act. Somebody raises a debate about the point, persons interested. Now, in this case, that's a pretty low bar, isn't it? You don't have to be directly interested or indirectly. It doesn't refer to somebody having a significant interest. You just have to have some interest in this estate, which to me, I'm not sure that's a good thing. And I would ask the minister, and I hope that our critic raises this, to elaborate more in committee on what kind of bar are they establishing when they say, actually in 14.1, a person having an interest in the estate. They don't have to have a direct interest, meaning I would think if you had a direct interest, that would mean that you would be a family member or someone who might be named in the estate. Here you have to have is just an interest. What is that legal bar for interest? And it doesn't say it has to be a significant interest or a substantial interest. So those two steps, those two tests, are not part of this. You just have to demonstrate you have an interest. And so, to me, that is, I think that may cause some judges to say, this is creating some, and this is what we talked about, the effects, the consequential impacts that you have for legislation that is not well drafted. Did you mean to say that anybody who thinks they have an interest in an estate, whether it be direct or indirect, can have a say in a court challenge to an estate? I think that many of us who've been involved in the settlements of estates and wills, no, it's already long enough, and there's enough challenges, and there's enough grief, and there's enough things that cause things to go off the rail. You don't want to have these challenges in court by someone who may say they have an interest. Legitimately, if you have a significant interest or you have a direct interest, fair enough. But just to say that you have an interest, is that a good enough test here? I will be talking more about this in a couple more minutes when I'm talking about Bill 189 when they raise the same question here. So people are out there looking at this, looking at the legislation of this government, and they're looking to say, so is it as good as it can be? And it's interesting, I just picked up on that. I'm sitting here. Over here in this one bar, they talk about substantial direct interest. Over here, they don't mention anything like that. And I would think in this case, this is much more critical. Like I would think in our own, I mean, like what family would like to have their, an estate settlement challenged by someone who simply has an interest, not a family interest, not a direct interest, not a substantial interest, not a significant interest, but just an interest. That's all the legislation says. Or are we leaving this to regulation? So I hope this gets raised and discussed more, because I do have a worry that this is interesting, this has come up this way. So at any rate, we're going to make sure we review this further and compare it to others, and it would be interesting to hear maybe from a few more people who've, particularly in the legal profession, who've had some experience with this. But I think that it would be interesting for us to hear as opposition from the public guardian and trustee their feelings about this. I think it's an important piece of legislation. So with that, Mr. Deputy Chair, I'm going to move adjournment on Bill 187. Thank you.
The member from Saskatoon Centre has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 187. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 12. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As we dig into these bills here in adjourned debates, it's apparent that the good folks at Justice and the law reform people have been doing a lot of work around the whole suite of acts as they relate to administration of estates and wills and public trustee and guardians, coroners. So all matters relating to death basically are now being reviewed through the lens of the legislative drafters, and this bill is no exception, Bill 188. So this is the Public Guardian Trustee Amendment Act. As you know, the public guardian and the trustee looks after the estates of people who die intestate or without a will, and that's not an uncommon thing, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I know the role that office plays in ensuring that the estates of people who pass away are properly looked after is incredibly important, particularly to the families of the deceased person and the people that would rightfully inherit those estates if they're able to do so. And my previous life as a legal counsel for the Government of Canada, we had a similar situation in the Indian Act, and it was in this case the Minister of Indian Affairs would be responsible for estates of people much the same as public trustee is in the provincial sphere. And Mr. Speaker, it was important work, and again, many times we would find people passing away without a will, and often complicated family situations. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I talked to in the previous bill when I was speaking, where there's been in the modern families, blended families are becoming the norm, Mr. Speaker, and the administration of those estates becomes a little more complicated as a result of that. The changes seem to be, for the most part, administrative, ensuring that there's errors in previous versions that are corrected. There's a whole new section on compensation agreements between prospective beneficiaries and air locator companies, and limits compensation to 10% of the distributable value of the estate. if you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, there are companies out there that are air locators. And I get a few emails from a Nigerian prince every now and then offering me, you know, if I helped him out, he'd get me all kinds of money and has this legal. I'm sure the member from Cannington's getting the same emails, maybe from a Nigerian princess perhaps, but you know, those scam emails that are out there offering to give you a portion of the estate if you would simply send them so much money. And I'm sorry, there's a comment again. No. He wanted to share, but he's not sharing anymore, Mr. Speaker. And so people get taken advantage of, and that's the role of public trustee as well. One of the interesting pieces, I think, is this idea of air locator companies, and that's not a business I would have ever thought of starting, Mr. Speaker, but obviously there's money in it, and if you have some heirs you want to locate, I'm sure there's people in your family that were wealthy in the past, and perhaps there's these estates just waiting to be distributed. This bill, though, however, will shut down on some of that, Mr. Speaker, and you know who the beneficiary of this is going to be? The General Revenue Fund, because this bill is now going to put a 6-year limit on monies realized from sales of people's belongings when they don't have a will. So if the public trustee has had to resolve your estate and you don't have any beneficiaries in your estate, if nobody claims that money after 6 years, Mr. Speaker, it goes to the General Revenue Fund. And not sure how this will benefit the bottom line for the planning that the Minister of Finance is currently undergoing in terms of keeping that balance in place, but there will be monies flowing in from the public trustee for those people whose estates are not claimed after 6 years. There's also, according to the minister's comments, as I spoke about in the previous bill when I was up speaking, there are often these mineral rights that are left behind, and it causes no end of problems when somebody's been dead for 120 years and yet there's still a mineral title in their name. And I know that's something that I did some work on in my previous life, Mr. Speaker. So the minister indicated that the proposed amendments to this bill will update the unclaimed assets provisions, which I talked about, to permit real property such as mine and mineral rights to escheat to the Crown if it is unclaimed after 6 years. I'm not sure about 6 years, Mr. Speaker. I think that's a bit of a rush. Many of these mines have not escheated to the Crown in the last 120 years, and I'm not sure why 6 years is being chosen here, so would certainly have a question about that. And it's not really clear in this bill that this does extend to mineral rights, although it does talk about selling off any selling off the estate and the interest and real property of the estate of a deceased person. So it's interesting that they're bringing in changes to escheats. And escheat, if I understand correctly, is where the Crown just takes people's property, private property that is unclaimed, basically. And currently there's a big, long, complicated, expensive court process to do that, because for the Crown to take back a personal property of any individual is a pretty heavy hammer, Mr. Speaker. So understandably, there's procedure in place to make sure that the Crown doesn't unjustly or frivolously, I guess, take back people's personal property. But in the case of these mineral titles, it's a long, historic situation, and I'm not sure why 6 years is being chosen as the limit for this. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure we're going to have other questions on this act, and other of my colleagues will want to enter in on the debate, so I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 188.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 189, the Coroner's Amendment Act 2019 is moved.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter into the debate on Bill 189, an act to amend the Coroners Act 1999. And in many ways, it sounds like it's time to do this work. We understand that Clive Wayhelm, that's known as both for his work police service in both Saskatoon and Regina, was appointed to undertake a review, and he did so, and this is what he's come up with, and in many ways it makes a lot of sense, and we hope this really helps out in terms of the accountability of making sure all deaths are accounted for and we know the cause and that there's nothing untoward about some of them. It's an important piece of legislation that we have before us. As I was saying before, though, it was interesting that we have had, as we do get feedback from people, and this one is from John Howard, and this is on Section 19, and this is the Section 37 amendment. On application by any person before or during an inquest, the coroner may grant standing at and then inquest if, in the opinion of the coroner, the person has direct and substantial interest. Now, in the inquest. Now, what they have said that they support that much of what's happening in terms of modernization, but they are concerned about the words direct and so they don't mind substantial interest, but they think of the two tests that are being put out there that you have to have a direct interest, and what does that mean, and a substantial interest. They think that the one test should be just substantial interest. So we'll be raising that, and I'm sure my colleague, the justice critic who's doing this work and reviewing this will make that point with the minister to see that, as we talked about, unintended consequences. We don't want people being shut out of the process who should be part of it because of this test of direct and substantial. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know many people will want to speak to this bill. We're looking forward to hearing more in committee, but at this point, I'm going to adjourn debate on Bill 189, an act to amend the Coroners Act 1999. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 189, the Coroners Amendment Act 2019. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Utana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about this Bill 190, and they're amending the Expropriation Procedure Act. And it's an interesting bill for me because this, the basic gist of the bill is to change the percentage interest rate on judgments that are granted from 6% to one more in accordance with what happens in other judgments, and that's the Prejudgment Act. So it's just going to bring it in line with other interest rates that are currently being used in court judgments. But what really is interesting to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that this comes to the attention of the government because of the extraordinary number of expropriations that have ended up in court as a result of the Regina bypass, Mr. Speaker. And as you know, and I should mention the GTH as well, because, Mr. Speaker, every piece of property at the GTH was expropriated, except for, of course, the ones that were purchased outright by Bill Boyd and Laurie Pusher back on the day when they bought the land from their Bill Boyd's landlord. But in the GTH, every piece of land there was expropriated, which is the purview of the government if, in fact, the expropriation is for public purposes. So there was a number of lawsuits brought against the government in the GTH land acquisition process, and it's well documented in the auditor's report. But what was interesting there is that not only did the government expropriate every acre of land in the original footprint, they got taken to court for every one of those expropriations, Mr. Speaker. And why was that, Mr. Speaker? Because the government made a lousy offer under the expropriation procedures. And what also is really interesting, Mr. Speaker, is not only did the government get taken to court by every piece of land that they expropriated at the GTH, they actually settled. They didn't even bother arguing their case in court, Mr. Speaker, because they knew they were going to lose, and so they ended up settling, and then they ended up paying double what they originally offered under the Expropriation Act. So you got to wonder what kind of ideas are going on over there when, first of all, you lowball your expropriation, which is illegal. You can't do that, Mr. Speaker. It has to be a reasonable offer. Then you end up in court, and then the government finds out, oh darn, not only are we having to double our original offer, but we have to pay 6% interest on it now because the Expropriation Act, Expropriation Procedure Act, has a legislated interest rate in it of 6%. So it's like a triple whammy on the taxpayer on this one, Mr. Speaker, when they can't get the original expropriation price right. They have to pay lawyers, end up in court, and then get into settlement agreements with every one of those people who had land expropriated at the GTH because they didn't make a proper offer, and then, Mr. Speaker, they had to pay 6% interest on top of it. So I don't know, if I could think of a more unfortunate series of events than how the land acquisition process at the GTH worked. But then, of course, you have to look at the bypass expropriation scene as well. And Mr. Speaker, of course, the government ended up in court on a number of those as well, and never once have they actually gone to court and had a judge rule. Virtually all of the cases that are completed now have been settled, Mr. Speaker, with large payments going to the individuals whose land was expropriated. So there are a couple cases, I think, that probably will end up in court because the original landowners are just so unhappy with the way they were treated that I don't think any amount of settlement would make them feel that they've had their say, they want their say in court. And so we're looking forward to seeing the results of those litigations, Mr. Speaker. But I just think the irony here is too rich when we have governments changing an act where they have done the most expropriation I think they've ever done through the GTH and the bypass, and then realize, oh darn, we have to pay 6% interest on every settlement that we've ended up in court. And Mr. Speaker, it's been a lot of these cases end up in court because the landowners weren't properly dealt with at the first go-around. They've had to hire lawyers, the government had to hire lawyers. There's all kinds of unnecessary litigation because the government simply couldn't get it right the first time, and I think taxpayers lose out on that, Mr. Speaker. But now they're going to fix at least the interest rate and tie it into the Prejudgment Act interest rate. So perhaps there will be, the individual litigants aren't going to get their 6%. It's going to be much lower, Mr. Speaker, but they will get their judgments for decisions that this government made that were not properly handled, and we've seen what the auditors had to say about that. But definitely, Mr. Speaker, the irony is rich in the content of this particular bill, and so I'm going to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Saskatoon-Untana has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 190. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate again today, this time on Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act of 2019. When the minister was providing a comment in a second reading speech, he indicated that these changes are coming forward due to a 2017 meeting that included all of the finance ministers from across Canada, that there was agreement in principle at that meeting that they would bring forth these changes, and that the changes are to strengthen beneficial ownership transparency and the understanding here, although the minister doesn't go into detail, he sort of indicates that there will be consistency across provinces, which certainly seems prudent, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but we should still make sure that we go through this with a fine-tooth comb and review what these changes are, and also examine whether there will be any unforeseen circumstances as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The minister was quite brief in his comments. Some of the changes that this bill proposes are adding a new provision on an individual with significant control over a corporation to reflect the language of a new Section 2.1 of the Canada Business Corporations Act, setting out the rules for determining an individual of significant control, or ISC, that the individual must have a significant number of shares, 25%, sets out the rules for 2 or more individuals with joint rights to be considered the ISC over a corporation, requires corporations to update corporate records by maintaining a register of the ISC. It requires a corporation to update its register within 15 days of becoming aware of new information that affects the register. It exempts some corporations from the requirement to maintain a register, allows the director of corporations to require a corporation to disclose the information about the ISC, and it allows the shareholders and creditors of a corporation to access the register of an ISC. We'll definitely be checking in with some corporate stakeholders to see what their thoughts are on this bill as well, and I know the critic will have a lot to say and members will have a lot to say, but with that I would move to adjourn debate on this bill for today.
The member from Saskatoon Fairview has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 191, the Business Corporation Amendment Act 2019. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 16, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 192, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Again, like always, it's a pleasure to be able to put my remarks on the record with regards to bill debates and having an opportunity to review legislation that's coming forward within this session. That's the one benefit of being in this role and having this opportunity is being able to review pieces of legislation that you might not have thought have even existed, and being able to review what that looks like and some of the proposed changes from the government. I don't know if backbenchers from the government actually review this as thoroughly as we do. If they did, maybe they would vote accordingly. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act, Bill number 192 here, this is a really important piece of legislation. We know how much our legal profession does within our province. They ensure that everything that we introduce here is adhered to, and so it's really important that they have legislation that they can review and adhere to as well. And so actually the critic with regards to this portfolio is also a lawyer, so she will know this piece of legislation, and I know she'll do her due diligence with reviewing it as well. So that's very handy. We have actually a great complement of individuals within our caucus here, so from all different professions, which I think really reflect the population, the Saskatchewan population. So But some of the changes with regards to this piece of legislation, I know that they're changing the name from Law Foundation into Law Foundation of Saskatchewan. And then I don't know if that was an important change or just one that they decided to while they were reviewing this piece. They are also adding a new definition of board to simplify references to the board of directors of the foundation throughout the Act. There's a lot of housekeeping amendments within different sections. They're changing the composition of the board to 4 persons appointed by the minister and 5 appointed by the benchers. And then they also extend the term of a member of the board from 2 to 3 years. I think that will require a lot of questions in committee, as well as the reasoning for those changes. Was that something that was requested by individuals in the field, Law Society potentially, or what was the decision from going to the different composition of the board and how the terms of the members? So why extending it? There may be good reason for that, but it'll be a good point of discussion. It requires the board to elect a chairperson and vice chairperson from among its members, rather than having the chairperson be appointed by the benchers. So again, another piece of important changes with regards to the board, and it'll be interesting to hear the reasons for that. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation. We will do our due diligence with regards to consulting stakeholders, and we'll be carefully reviewing it to check if any of the changes brought up in the previous legislation requires our close attention. And I know I have other colleagues who would like to add their remarks on the bill debate. So with that, I adjourn debate on bill number 192.
The member from Prince Albert Northcote has moved to adjourn debate on bill number 192. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 17, resume debate on the second reading motion for bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. Mr. Peterson.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Utana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's me again, rising once again to speak to the amazing and scintillating legislative agenda that this government has put forward this fall. This is a government that's old and tired, they're out of ideas, and what we see is basically cleanup. This is like the B string coming in, Mr. Speaker, and cleaning up because there's no ideas and nothing forward thinking coming from the A team over there, Mr. Speaker. So here's another example of that. Statute Law Amendment Act. We have exciting things like the word foreman being changed to foreperson in a number of statutes. We have striking out the word department and replacing it with ministry, always a riveting change, Mr. Speaker. Of course, workmen in the SaskTel Act is being now substituted with workers. So it's always important, Mr. Speaker, to make sure language is gender neutral wherever possible, and I don't want to undermine that, Mr. Speaker. And a few more changes in here. The Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations is now, of course, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, so that change is being made to 4 acts as well. So that's really about it, Mr. Speaker. I don't have much more to say, so I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 193 and act to amend the statute law.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on bill number 183. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 18, resume debate on the second reading motion for bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Belanger.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Utana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Final bill of the day, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statute Amendment Act. This was tabled in the House here last week, and this really is a substantial bill, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of changes being made to municipal statutes, things such as cities being able to elect to amalgamate into municipalities that surround them, and that's just one of the many changes that are being proposed here. I want to thank the Minister for giving a good review of all the changes. I think there's enough in the second reading speech to give people some understanding of some of the changes that are being attempted here. Mr. Speaker, the Minister indicated that there's been reaching out to the municipal sector stakeholders, and what is interesting, Mr. Speaker, is some of the highlights that she raised, and the first of the one is protection of reprisal, Mr. Speaker, which is interesting because that topic has come up in the House lately when it comes to shushing some of the Saskatchewan Health Authority employees in a very direct letter from that authority. And here we have the government, and here's what the Minister said: workplace harassment is a growing concern, and it is important to protect those who report it and other wrongdoing from further suffering as a consequence. And we know there were stories in the past of municipal employees being harassed, and in fact one tragic tale of suicide, Mr. Speaker, for a municipal employee who was harassed beyond what he could bear. And that tragedy, I think, may have informed some of these changes, and I hope that it has. But when we have a government on one side moving to protect people from fear of reprisal when they're reporting wrongdoing, and yet we can't get changes to the act where health authority workers, the frontline workers, will get the same protection from fear of reprisal. Mr. Speaker, so it's kind of a left-hand, right-hand kind of situation that we see happening here, and I hope that the Minister of Health will take a page out of the book of the Minister for Government Relations and ensure that health workers get the same protections that the Minister is attempting to bring in for municipal workers, Mr. Speaker, because it is fair. It's only fair for health workers to have that same protection rather than being told by their bosses that they really shouldn't be saying anything at all. So that's the first category of changes. The second category here is administrative efficiencies for municipalities, and again, an effort to modernize and streamline and just various legislative language changes that recognize modern communications like emails and facsimiles. Mr. Speaker, this also will allow municipal offices to only keep tax rolls and assessment rolls for 10 years, and there's other modernization coming in the regulations for that portion. And then the third area that the Minister highlighted was the attempt to strengthen and improve local governments. And these are things, well, as you know, in some cases, administrators and clerks kind of run the show in municipalities, Mr. Speaker, because they know what they're doing. They're very experienced, they're trained, and therefore I think the rural municipal councillors in Reeves really rely on them for direction when it comes to the administrative part of the work. But sometimes those offices are vacant, or if they're temporarily absent, and then the Reeve and the councillors still need to be able to do their work. So there's some changes being made here, I think, that are probably going to help RMs do their work better. The certification of administrators is also being recognized here. And Mr. Speaker, I think you will recall some stories in the media recently about an administrator, I think in the village of Pine House, that was not properly certified. And I think when you look at the issues that have come up in that particular community, Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Government Relations really needs to ensure that those taxpayers and ratepayers in that village are being protected, and that the proper kind of administrators are in place. So, Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward to getting that report and seeing how the government will ensure that the administration of monies going into Pine House and government programs that are being utilized by Pine House residents are being properly administered. This is serious, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that we will soon see the results of that investigation. That was quite some time ago when it was ordered by the previous minister. The minister also talked about stakeholder requests for improvements to the legislation, saying that councils have to hold their members to a high standard to which they're elected, and the important work that councils do. So there's the government is now making some changes requested by municipalities to enhance their autonomy and flexibility. Mr. Speaker, I think there's two sides to that. When you talk about increasing autonomy and flexibility, I think it has to be equally reinforced with ensuring that the responsibilities are being properly managed by the people with that autonomy and people with that flexibility. And I know that sitting on the RM Council is no reward, Mr. Speaker. My brother currently sits on the RM in my home rural municipality. My father was a reeve for many years, and I know that it is a thankless job. And I want to give kudos to all those councillors who put their name forward to take care of that local government, which is so important to the management of communities, both rural and urban here in Saskatchewan. So it is a thankless job. Often I think councillors are overwhelmed by the number of complaints that they receive because most often you would hear from someone when they're unhappy more than when they're actually happy. So, and I think you would know councillors yourself, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that could attest to that as well. But we need to make sure that the responsibility and the oversight is there as well, and that's the role of the ministry. And so there are a number of changes here. I think it's fairly new to us, and we need to take some time and consult with local RM councillors and urban councillors from the SUMA organization to make sure that these changes reflect not only what they're asking for, but I think what is appropriate as we move forward in the municipal governance here in Saskatchewan. And so, Mr. Speaker, I know there's lots more. This is a very large bill, and there's lots more to say. But for today, I will move to adjourn the debate on Bill number 194, the Miscellaneous Municipal Statutes Amendment Act 2019.
The member from Saskatoon-Newtown has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 194. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved that this House adjourns. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.